I was in a terrible car crash while rushing to see my sister in labor. My parents abandoned me, blamed me, and lied to everyone. A couple of years back, while I was still in college, I got into a terrible car accident. A drunk truck driver slammed straight into my car, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. I spent weeks there, recovering. My arm was fractured, but that was the least of it. It took me ages to relearn how to walk. And even after that, the scars stuck around for what felt like forever. It's been almost 3 years since that night, but to this day, I'm extra cautious when I'm behind the wheel, even though none of it was my fault. What I remember most from that time isn't the pain or the struggle to heal. No, what really stuck with me was the fact that my family never showed up, not even once. My sister had gone into labor that same night, and apparently, that took priority over everything else. The irony? I was actually on my way to surprise her at the hospital when the accident happened. I was just a few weeks away from graduating, and my college wasn't too far from home, so I'd gotten used to making the trip back and forth. When my parents called to say my sister was in labor and they were rushing her to the hospital, I thought it'd be a nice gesture to show up and surprise her. Since I didn't have my own car at the time, I borrowed a friend's and hit the road. But before I ever made it there, disaster struck. After the crash, I was taken to the nearest hospital, and while I was lying there in pain, it was mostly my friends who stood by me. My parents were too caught up with my sister and the baby, which I understood, I really did. What got to me, though, was that even after my sister had given birth, my parents still didn't bother checking in on me. Not once. I called them several times, despite how difficult it was for me to even stay conscious, let alone hold a phone. Every time I woke up, I'd ask if they had called or come by, and every time, I was disappointed. About a week after the accident, they finally did call. But it wasn't to ask how I was doing, it was just to question why I'd been calling so much. Apparently, they'd been intentionally ignoring my calls because they were busy with my sister. That hit me hard. I mean, given the situation, I thought they'd at least show some concern. But instead, they were cold, detached. Still, I asked about my sister and the baby, and they casually told me both were doing fine. That was it. Not a single question about me. At that point, I had to say something. So I told them what had happened, that I'd been in a serious accident, that I'd been trying to reach them for days. And you know what their reaction was? Nothing. Just a flat acknowledgement that they already knew. My friends had reached out to them, filled them in, and yet they hadn't even cared enough to respond. That's when I lost it. I asked them point blank if they really couldn't even pretend to care. And that's when they dropped the real bombshell. They admitted they had purposely ignored me. They didn't think my accident was important enough to pull their attention away from my sister's delivery. Worse, they outright blamed me for what happened. At first, I was confused. I wasn't the one who had been drinking, I hadn't done anything reckless. But they weren't talking about that. According to them, I had brought it on myself by deciding to drive late at night. They said it was irresponsible of me to take that trip and that if I hadn't been so careless, none of this would have happened. Even when I explained that I was on my way to support my sister, they brushed it off, saying it was unnecessary. In their eyes, I had no one to blame but myself. That was the last straw for me. I was already dealing with so much pain, trauma, recovery, and instead of supporting me, my own family was treating me like I was the problem. I hung up without another word. Later on, I found out something even worse. When emergency responders arrived at the scene of the crash and called my parents, their first point of contact, they refused to come. They even asked not to be contacted again. That's how my college ended up getting involved. Someone found my ID, called the school, and my friends were the ones who finally stepped up. That was the moment I realized something I had probably been avoiding my whole life. My family had no interest in being there for me. And it wasn't just about the accident. Even before that, I had always felt like I came second to my sister. I guess this just confirmed it. For the last 3 years, I haven't spoken to them. I didn't cut ties out of anger, but because I finally understood that I was never a priority to them. Just to be clear, I never expected them to abandon my sister while she was in labor. That wasn't the issue. What hurt was that even after the baby was born, they still didn't think I was worth their time. I never expected my sister to visit me in the hospital. Obviously, that would have been impossible given the circumstances. But my parents? They had no such excuse. My sister had her fiancé and his family by her side, making sure she was taken care of. I, on the other hand, only had my friends. Thankfully, they were the kind of friends who stepped up when I needed them most. They supported me through my recovery, both emotionally and financially. Their parents even pitched in to cover my medical bills and other expenses, something I'll be repaying for a long time. But no matter how much I try, I know I'll never truly be able to pay them back for what they did for me. I owe them more than I can put into words. Even though 3 years have passed since the accident, my parents have never once reached out to me. Not a single call, not even a message. Meanwhile, other family members have questioned why I no longer have a relationship with them, but I've always kept my reasons to myself. It seemed like we had a silent agreement not to discuss the situation with anyone else in the family. At least, that's how it was until recently. A couple of weeks ago, my parents finally decided to speak about what happened. They were hosting a family dinner at their house to celebrate my sister's promotion, and at some point during the evening, someone brought up my absence. After 3 years of avoiding the subject, my parents figured it was time to give their version of events. But instead of telling the truth, they twisted the story to make themselves look like the victims. They admitted that I had been on my way to surprise my sister when I got into the accident. That much was true. But after that, everything they said was a lie. They claimed that no one had contacted them at the time, that they only found out about the accident days later, by which point so much time had passed that they assumed I hadn't reached out to them either. According to them, as soon as they found out, they called me, but I was so upset that I refused to speak to them. They even said they had tried to contact me multiple times after that, but I had shut them out completely. And eventually, they just stopped trying. They made it sound like the whole thing had been a misunderstanding, like I had been the one holding a grudge over something small. To the rest of the family, it must have seemed like I had unfairly cut them off over a single mistake. One of my aunts, being the good Samaritan she is, decided to reach out to me after hearing their side of the story. Apparently, my parents had specifically told everyone not to speak to me about it. They didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But I knew the real reason. They didn't want anyone talking to me because they were afraid I'd expose the truth. When my aunt got in touch, she told me that 3 years had gone by, and my parents missed me. She said I was missing out on my chance to be an aunt to my niece, and that if she were in my shoes, she wouldn't throw away an opportunity like that. Her words caught me off guard. I didn't understand why she was saying all this, so I called her back for a real conversation. That's when she told me what my parents had been telling the family. Hearing it firsthand was like a punch to the gut. They had painted me as selfish and unforgiving, making it seem like they had done everything they could to reach out, only for me to turn my back on them. In reality, it had been the exact opposite. They had known about my accident from the start but had chosen not to be bothered with it. They had ignored my calls, refused to show up, and when they finally did speak to me, they blamed me for what happened. Yet here they were, rewriting history to make themselves look like the caring, concerned parents who had been unfairly shut out of my life. I was furious. I told my aunt the truth, every detail. I even offered to put her in touch with my friends, the same friends who had been the ones to take care of me while my own parents turned their backs. If she needed proof, they could confirm everything. It didn't take much for her to realize I was telling the real story. She was shocked. And once she understood what had really happened, she actually apologized to me for believing them in the first place. I was just grateful she had reached out, because if she hadn't, I never would have known what my parents were saying behind my back. After that conversation, word started to spread. More and more people in the family reached out, telling me that I had done the right thing by setting the record straight. If I had stayed silent, my parents would have gotten away with their lies, making me the villain in a story where I was the one who had been wronged. For the first time in years, I started receiving messages of sympathy instead of judgment. Relatives told me they had no idea how badly I had been treated, that my parents had been cruel and unfair to me. And in a way, I'm grateful to my aunt. Because if she hadn't decided to hear me out, none of this would have come to light. If it weren't for my aunt, the truth probably never would have come out. She made sure people heard my side of the story, and because of that, my parents didn't get away with their lies. But now, things have gotten a little messy. Ever since my parents found out that I had told my aunt the truth and that she had gone on to share it with the rest of the family, people have started to distance themselves from them. And somehow, they've decided that all of this is my fault. I honestly don't see how I'm to blame. All I did was tell my aunt what really happened. That's it. I didn't go out of my way to expose them to everyone. I only told her, and she was the one who decided to spread the truth. But now, my parents are acting like I've personally orchestrated some grand scheme to turn the family against them. Apparently, no one in the family wants to speak to them anymore. Some have even started outright ignoring them. To make matters worse, my niece's 3rd birthday is coming up soon. That also means it'll be the 3rd anniversary of my accident. But instead of being concerned about how I might be feeling about that, my parents are focused on something else entirely, the fact that no one has responded to their invitations for the birthday party. Some family members have already declined without even bothering to give a reason, and my parents are convinced it's because of me.
Now, after 3 years of complete silence, my family has suddenly started blowing up my phone. I've been getting call after call, text after text. I haven't answered a single one of them. I don't see the point.
Most of their messages are nothing but accusations, claiming I did all of this intentionally to steal my sister's spotlight. According to them, I still can't get over the fact that they chose to be with my sister while she was giving birth instead of coming to see me. In their twisted version of events, this is all some elaborate act of revenge. They even went as far as saying that I had purposely gone out late that night to get into an accident, just so I could make myself the center of attention. That was the most disgusting thing they could have said. The idea that I would put my own life on the line, would willingly go through that pain and trauma just to get attention from my family? It was vile. I would never think that way about another person, no matter how much I disliked them. But that's exactly what they were accusing me of. And it didn't stop there. They claimed I was still trying to get attention even now, that I had heard about my sister's promotion and just couldn't stand that she was doing well in life. In their minds, I had deliberately dredged up the past just to make them look bad. The hypocrisy of it all made me furious. They were the ones twisting the story. They were the ones trying to control the narrative. And yet, they had the audacity to accuse me of the very thing they were doing. I ignored their messages. I blocked their numbers. But a few days ago, they crossed a line. My parents actually showed up at my house. They stood outside, demanding that I fix the situation I had supposedly created. My niece's birthday was coming up, and they couldn't let her party be ruined. They wanted me to contact my aunt and the rest of the family and tell them that I had been lying, that everything I said was just some elaborate attempt to make my parents look bad. They expected me to do this for them. After everything they had put me through, they actually thought I owed them this favor. That was when I lost my temper. When they started yelling outside my house, I refused to let them in. I told them flat out that if they didn't leave, I'd call the cops. I wasn't going to entertain their nonsense. Whatever they were asking of me was far beyond anything they deserved, considering how little they had done for me when I needed them most. But the threat of the police didn't scare them. My dad doubled down, calling me an attention seeker, accusing me of trying to ruin their reputation and now going after my sister and her daughter just to be petty. He said I had better use my phone to call our relatives and set the record straight. But by straight, he meant telling everyone their version of the truth, the one where they were the victims and I was the villain. They just wouldn't stop yelling, and I snapped. I shoved them off my property. At first, they were stunned that I had actually gotten physical. But once the shock wore off, they started retaliating. By that point, I was beyond reasoning with. I was so angry, so full of rage, that I didn't stop pushing them until they were out on the street. Even then, I kept shoving, kept screaming. And then I said something I probably shouldn't have. I yelled that I hoped a car would come along and run them over, and that no one would come to visit them in the hospital just like they had abandoned me after my accident. That shut them up real quick. They just stood there, completely stunned. Once I was done screaming, I turned around and walked back inside, ignoring them. And thankfully, they didn't try to bother me again. But later that night, my sister called. She told me that what I had done was excessive, that if I had been so upset, I should have just stayed inside and called the cops instead of opening the door. She said my reaction had traumatized my parents and that I owed them an apology. And the truth is, I do feel bad about the way I handled it. I know myself well enough to say that what happened outside my house wasn't like me at all. That kind of violent reaction, it's just not who I am. So yeah, I do feel a little conflicted about shoving my parents when they showed up uninvited after 3 years of complete silence. And here's why it's such a big deal. It's not just that I lost my temper and got physical. It's the fact that I'm a trained MMA fighter. I'm not a professional, but I'm still significantly stronger than both of my parents. For me to put my hands on them like that, it must have been overwhelming for them. My sister even claimed that I left them bruised, though I wouldn't be surprised if she exaggerated that just to make me feel guilty. Either way, I get why it was traumatizing for them. The thing is, I'm still not sure whether I owe them an apology or not. My sister certainly thinks I do. In fact, she's so convinced that she's outright threatened to press charges against me if I don't publicly admit that I was lying about them. She expects me to retract everything I said and tell the entire family that I made up all those things just to paint my parents in a bad light. It's absurd. She knows the truth. She knows exactly what happened, yet she's still trying to strong-arm me into backing down. That just feels wrong. I've told her straight up I won't be bullied into apologizing. If I ever decide to say I'm sorry, it'll be because I genuinely feel remorse, not because I'm afraid of whatever empty threats she's making. Update 1. It's been 2 days since I posted here, and after reading through the comments and thinking things over, I've made my decision.
I'm not apologizing. I'm also done interacting with my sister.
Up until now, I never really took issue with her. When we were kids, she was good to me, and I guess that's why I hadn't fully turned against her like I did with our parents.
But now?
It's clear she's just as bad as they are.
I can't keep letting them walk all over me.
If I apologize now, it'll just set a precedent that they can intimidate me into silence whenever it suits them.
That's not going to happen anymore.
They don't get to rewrite history to make themselves look good at my expense. They were the ones who showed up at my door. They were the ones who refused to leave when I told them I didn't want to talk. They were the ones who started threatening me.
And if my sister actually decides to press charges? Fine. I'll argue that I was provoked.
And let's be honest, shoving them off my property isn't exactly a major crime.
It's not like they sustained any real injuries.
I was just trying to get them to leave.
At this point, I'm prepared for whatever comes next.
But one thing is certain, I will not be apologizing.
Not now, not ever. Because I'm absolutely not sorry. Update 2.
Today was supposed to be my niece's big birthday party, the one my parents were so worried about.
And guess what? Nobody showed up. I found out through my aunt.
She called me to let me know that, after hearing the truth about what happened to me all those years ago, the entire family decided to skip the party.
Some people didn't even bother to respond to the invitations, and those who did outright declined.
It wasn't just about what happened 3 years ago, how my parents refused to be there for me when I needed them most. No, what really pushed people away was the fact that, even after all this time, they still chose to lie about it. They didn't just neglect me, they actively tried to rewrite history to make themselves look better.
That was something no one in the family could accept. Hearing that made me emotional.
While talking to my aunt, I finally let out everything I'd been holding in for the past 3 years. I had bottled it all up, tried to bury it, convinced myself that it wasn't worth talking about. But that conversation made me realize just how much pain I had been carrying. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel it. I cried. I cried because for so long, I thought nobody would have cared even if they had known. But my aunt assured me that if anyone had been aware of my accident back then, they would have come to support me. The only reason no one did was because I had kept it all to myself. I had deactivated all my social media, distanced myself from everyone, and when people reached out, I just told them I was fine.
The truth was, I wasn't fine. Not physically, not emotionally.
It was the darkest chapter of my life, and I had gone through it completely alone.
But I'm not alone now. My aunt reminded me that if I ever needed anything in the future, I now know who to call.
And I'm grateful for her for standing by me these past few weeks, for being the one person who actually cared enough to listen. Of course, now that the party has been a total disaster, I know my sister and my parents are going to be furious.
But honestly, that's not my problem. At this point, I'm just bracing myself for whatever comes next. Honestly, the only person I feel bad for in all of this is my niece.
I've never met her, never had any interaction with her, but I can only imagine how disappointing it must have been to have no one show up for her birthday. She's just 3 years old, so she probably won't even remember this in a few years, and I'm sure my sister and her husband will find a way to make it up to her. Still, it's not her fault any of this happened.
Update 3. It's been a week since my last update, and a few things have happened. The biggest one? My parents reached out to me again.
Since I had blocked them everywhere, they resorted to making yet another email account just so they could get a message through. In the email, they admitted that they regretted how they treated me 3 years ago. They said that at the time, they were just really stressed out over my sister's delivery and got too caught up in everything to pay attention to what I was going through. They even said that, looking back, they now agree they should have at least come to visit me. That was a first. It was strange seeing them finally admit they had made a mistake.
But honestly,
at this point, it doesn't change anything. The damage has already been done. They can't just say a few words and erase what happened. Maybe if they had sent this email a couple of months after the accident, I would have felt differently. But they waited 3 whole years and only acknowledged their mistake after being confronted by the entire family.
It's too late now.
I've already accepted my place in all of this. I've come to terms with the fact that their priority has always been my sister, not me.
And you know what? I'm okay with that. I've made my peace with it.
So their apology, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't mean anything to me. The second thing they mentioned in the email was that they had talked to my sister, and together they had decided not to press charges against me for what happened the other day.
Good for them, I guess. Not that it would have mattered if they did.
I was already prepared for whatever they wanted to throw at me.
Anyway, after we sorted things out through that email, I responded,
telling them it was fine but that I didn't want them to contact me again. They took things a step further. They put out a public statement on social media. In it, they claimed that we had cleared the air and that they would appreciate it if the rest of the family stopped getting involved in this feud now that it was all over. That was all I needed to know about their real intentions. They didn't apologize because they genuinely felt bad. They apologized because they wanted the rest of the family to stop judging them. After the birthday party fiasco, they finally realized that people weren't on their side. Their silence spoke volumes. No one was okay with what they had done, and they were starting to feel the consequences. That's why they suddenly decided to fix things. But, of course, they still had to frame themselves as the victims. Even in their so-called resolution, they made sure to control the narrative, acting like they were the ones being wronged. Whatever. Honestly, I don't even care anymore. I'm just relieved that this whole mess is finally over. I can go back to living my life without them in it. And that's the best outcome I could have asked for.